Okay, so I guess I'm going to shoot a response here to Peter at Tooltime, and the video is called Smartphones and the Future of Books, a Dialogue. And I really appreciate that video. Peter, I'm going to see if I can't try to talk about, I guess, some related things. I am going to address very directly some of these questions that you put toward the end about e-readers and font size and, just what Neil Postman's sense of some of this would have been or, was at the time of the mid 80s. But I wanted to first see if we can't engage in a kind of phenomenological inquiry, right? I mean, phenomenology is a kind of study of what shows itself. It's sometimes called the study of the perpetual beginner, where you try to see things with fresh eyes. And I think part of the question is, what are some of the key differences between the senses? Now, I think we commonly say, well, all information just gets processed by the brain, and so, the brain is the seat of it. Well, I don't think we want to dispute the centrality of the brain, but even if the brain does integrate and synthesize and it does different things, and I'm going to try to talk about, maybe brain a little bit more in some future videos, but the senses themselves are very different. And so let's take touch, taste, and smell, which are sometimes called the bedroom senses, and then sight and hearing, which are distant senses. They're also sometimes called predator-prey senses. It's, depends on the literature that you're looking at. But if I talk about touch, taste, and smell, there's a sense in which the object tasted and the taste of the object are the same, right? When I touch a material and the material touched, they're the same. Now, there is a sense in which, I guess, smells have some register of the larger context. That is, if I'm eating a certain food in a smelly room, it interferes. But, smell, there's actual chemical interference that's going on. I mean, there are chemical processes that you're picking up different scents intermingling with, the scent of the food that you're eating. When you move to sight and hearing, one of the things that's so interesting is that sight and hearing, as distant senses, they deal with waves. Now, whether those are light waves, photons moving at very high speed, or vibrations. Now, generally, those would be air vibrations, what we call them sound waves moving through the air, making the air vibrate, expand, and contract in various ways. And then, we pick it up on, in our ears. What's interesting is that sight, again, sight and sound are context relative in a way that touch, taste, and smell seem not to be. Again, when I taste something, what I've tasted and the taste of it, they're bound in a whole. But when I have a patch of a color, for example, the patch of a color will give a certain hue, but when I place it next to a different color, it actually slightly changes its hue. Drapery, it can look very different depending upon the wallpaper that it's next to, or even the color of an item in a room. It really does change depending upon the larger whole that's going on. So sight is in one way much more context dependent, and it has a register of contextual elements within a particular item that's perceived. Now, the same is for sound. Sound, in a lot of ways, sound is a register of more than that which was making the sound. It includes and picks up vibrations from the larger environment. If you play a piano note in a large auditorium as opposed to a small, stuffy room, you can hear it in the note. Someone who's a trained musicologist, they may be able to, with their eyes closed, tell if there's curtains on a wall simply by the way a sound, by the way a note sounds, or by the way it's played. And I bring up this belabored point here about the difference between sight and sound, and it's sort of like, sight and sound deals with whole-to-whole relations, whereas touch, taste, and smell kind of deal with part-to-whole relations. But the point is that it's really interesting because sight and sound have been fully digitized, where the other senses have not. And that's why I'm again sort of belaboring this. I think it's important for people to think about that. What does it mean to say that the two sensory capacities, which were most geared toward distant register and most geared into some way picking up the context in which they occurred, those were actually the two that became most subject to decontextualization, to manipulation, and again, to the forms of digital process that we see. That is, touch, taste, and smell have not been digitized. Now, I think part of this, it has to do with theories of mimesis, the way we learn language, the way that people learn to imitate the sights and sounds around them, and the way that they don't imitate the smells around them. I mean, there's lots of things that are going on there. But for Postman, when he gets to amusing ourselves to death, and he's trying to say, it was written, as you say, in the mid 80s, I think, yeah, 85, maybe 86 it was reprinted, but it was sort of following on the, I guess, the apocryphal follow-out of 1984 and sort of comparing Huxley's Brave New World to Orwell's 1984, and he basically says that the tragedy is that it's not going to be the thought police cracking down. Instead, it's going to be people basically amusing themselves to death. They don't need an external thought police to keep them in check. They're just going to trivialize themselves. He says, who would have thought that Big Brother turned out to be Howdy Doody? He's got some funny lines in that book. But his point is that what conspired was the telegraph and the photograph. See, the photograph gives a decontextualized image, and then when that was combined with the telegraph, suddenly you had these visceral, like emotive images completely out of context. And the idea of sights, of images, and now sounds being able to be brought anywhere at any time and sort of cut to any size through digital technologies, it leads to a very rapid an overflow, we'll say, of irrelevant information. Of people aren't sure what the point of this is. In the ancient world, they said to even want to know what's going on in Constantinople was a bad thing. Now we suddenly are filled with information to which, how do the people possibly meaningfully act with regard to it? What do they do? I don't know, they trivialize their lives by pretending with their friends that this is the important stuff. I mean, I think that's part of it. Okay, so this whole issue of the rise of decontextualized information, of people trivializing themselves by not building their lives around goals and purposes and values, and then letting the information crop up as relevant to that. Instead, I think many people have made information the new God, and they act like by getting enough information they're going to come up with their values or their goals or their purposes. And it just doesn't happen that way. The information is a function of goal seeking, not the other way around. Okay, and I have lots of videos on some of this. The thing about e-readers okay, so let's do the font size first. The font size is really a problem. And I say that because one of the most important and significant developments in the history of literacy was the standardization of paper, the 8.5 by 11 that we all now think of as paper. I mean, paper science is in fact very modern. Paper science is very difficult. It was late in coming, and in the past, all the way up until printing press, you're looking at around 15th century, but up until that, it's called manuscript culture, and that goes, all the way through the medieval period, all the way back even to the ancients, where, they had scrolls and parchment, vellum, and all of them were different sizes and different shapes. I mean, the odds of finding two scrolls of the exact same dimensions, just almost unheard of. I mean, most things that were written on were of varied size, and the standardization of font, the standardization of page size was an absolute revolution. You know, Margaret Mead, who was Gregory Bateson's, married to Gregory Bateson, famous anthropologist, but she tells a story of when she was on an island with some natives, and a carton of books had washed up, and none of the natives have ever seen any books before, and this particular box of books was all filled with the exact same book. And the natives didn't know what to do with it. Not only had they never seen anything that was identical before, I mean, everything was absolutely identical in the way that even the leaves of nature are just slightly different. They're little variations. But it's the identicality that makes it so powerful, that we can all pull out a copy and I could say, okay, the second paragraph on page 134, and we all turn to that to realize the kind of potency of collectively orchestrated study. For me to send you an email and go, hey, you know, the third paragraph on page whatever, and we can look at that and find that. When everyone's changing font size and everyone's looking at things and we don't have universal agreement upon what page something occurred, it gets very hard to reference, it gets very hard to fact check, it gets very hard to see if someone was misquoting or correctly citing it. And I don't think that you really do have backscanning. Okay, and I've been noticing a lot lately. I mean, I'm on a doctoral dissertation committee right now. I'm looking at a guy who wrote a very, very big size dissertation. I mean, it's 400 single-spaced pages. And when you have this big document, you're folding it back and forth, and you're writing notes. You're saying, well, see this earlier page, and on what paragraph, and you're flipping back and forth. And you might even have 4 or 5 pages open at a given time, and you're kind of flipping back and forth. When you're scrolling up and down on the screen, I mean, I have texts on the computer, I mean, obviously, and I find it taxing. Even when I'm working on my own work, like when I write a paper, I find it very difficult to proof check on screen or even to do sophisticated integrative synthesis kind of work. You know, I can download stuff and I can kind of work on the computer, but if I want to very carefully see how the whole is arranged, I need to print it out. I need to print it out and sort of flip pages back and forth and then look and see the paragraphs as a whole. And you can sort of do that on the computer. I mean, I admit it. You know, if I zoom in and do it at 100% on my computer and I can only see like one paragraph at a time, I can really read, you know, did the sentences flow nice and stuff like this, but you don't get a sense of the whole document. Whereas if you turn it into like 50% or 25%, I can get, you know, maybe 2 pages of the document at a time and I can hardly see it, I gotta squint. But as I'm looking at it, I get a much better sense of the whole. That physical manual sense of the whole, I think, is really crucial. I guess the last thing I would say is that it is right. It's very, very significant for people to understand what public domain and copyright expiration is. I mean, it's amazing the number of brilliant works that are now you can use for free, cite for free. You don't have to pay copyright. You can reproduce them. I mean, the significance of some of this is it's profound, and more people should be celebrating the kinds of information that are available to people and the access that people are going to have for free as a result of that. But I think all that it's something to maybe keep in the background while we're maybe turning attention toward the fact that all the access in the world doesn't help. If you don't have goals, if you're not really up to something, if you haven't made it your life's goal to be a cultivated, thoughtful, well-read human being, if you haven't made that your goal, if you haven't decided that, you know, the relationship with the dead and the greatest minds that have ever lived, those are your dialogue interlocutors, and those are the people you're after. Until people really start to think that way, it doesn't help them to have the access. Instead, it becomes like a uniform that they get to whip out and go, oh, look, I have Dostoevsky here on my phone. Yeah, I haven't read it, couldn't tell you much about Dostoevsky, but I have it here on my phone. It becomes, you know, it's like a fashion accessory in consumer capitalism. It's not a It's not a kind of medium that's used as a shaping stone for growth and self-cultivation and stuff like that. Okay, so thanks. I enjoyed your video, and okay, take care. Bye-bye.